In a quaint little house on Elm Street, there lived a cat named Sebastian. Now, you might think that cats don't have much interest in music, but Sebastian was an exception. He had a deep, burning desire to become a piano virtuoso, and so his parents were adamant that he take piano lessons. Sebastian's parents were convinced that their feline son had hidden talents just waiting to be uncovered. So, one sunny afternoon, they signed him up for lessons with the most renowned piano teacher in town, Mrs. Prudence Whiskertons. Mrs. Whiskertons was notorious for being strict and had a reputation for turning even the most tone-deaf students into musical prodigies. Her lessons were not for the faint of heart, and she expected nothing less than perfection from her pupils. The first day of Sebastian's piano lessons arrived, and he was filled with a mix of excitement and dread. He strolled into Mrs. Whiskerton's elegant parlor, where a grand piano took center stage. Sebastian took a seat on the piano bench, his furry paws poised over the keys. Mrs. Whiskertons, a prim and proper tabby with a stern expression, peered down at him through her bifocals. "Let's begin, shall we?" she said in a no-nonsense tone. Sebastian nodded nervously, his tail twitching like a metronome gone mad. Mrs. Whiskertons placed sheet music in front of him and pointed to the first note. "Play this note, Sebastian." "It's a C." Sebastian eyed the sheet music, then the keys, and tentatively pressed a key. The resulting sound was more akin to a screeching door than a melodious note. Mrs. Whiskertons winced. "No, no, Sebastian. That was dreadful. Try again, and this time, with feeling." Sebastian gulped and tried again, this time with a little more force. The sound was marginally better, but still far from what Mrs. Whiskertons considered acceptable. The weeks that followed were filled with Sebastian's clumsy attempts at playing the piano. Mrs. Whiskerton's patience dwindled with each off-key note, and her critiques became increasingly scathing. "Sebastian, have you no sense of rhythm? Even a metronome could do better than this. Is that supposed to be a musical interpretation, or are you trying to summon a banshee?" Sebastian's determination was unwavering, though. He practiced diligently day and night, much to the dismay of his parents, who were often woken up by his cacophonous playing. One evening, as Sebastian was practicing a particularly tricky piece, his parents decided to intervene. They sauntered into the parlor and exchanged worried glances at the discordant sounds coming from the piano. "Sebastian, dear," his mother said gently, "perhaps piano isn't your true calling. Have you ever considered something else, like bird watching or napping?" But Sebastian was resolute. "No, Mom, Dad. I want to be a pianist, and I won't give up." His parents sighed and exchanged another glance. "Very well, Sebastian," his father said. "We'll support you in your quest to become a pianist, no matter how painful it is for our eardrums." Sebastian smiled, grateful for his parents' support, even if they didn't fully understand his passion. He knew he had to improve, and so he continued his lessons with Mrs. Whiskertons. Sebastian's piano lessons were a symphony of clumsiness, a cacophony of comical mishaps that would have left even the most patient teacher questioning the laws of physics. Firstly, there was Sebastian's issue with coordination, or lack thereof. Whenever Mrs. Whiskertons instructed him to use both paws to play the keys, it was as if his paws had minds of their own. One paw would land on a note while the other would hover awkwardly in mid-air, as if debating whether it should join the performance or not. This resulted in a jarring discord of half-played notes that could make a dog howl in confusion. Then there was Sebastian's frequent confusion with musical terms. Mrs. Whiskertons would say things like, "Play that passage allegro," and Sebastian would respond with a puzzled look, muttering, "Allegro? Is that the name of a new catnip flavor?" He'd then attempt to mimic what he thought allegro might sound like, resulting in an ungodly tempo that could only be described as ferocious. Let's not forget his perpetual battle with the pedals. Sebastian could never quite remember which pedal did what, and his little paws would get tangled up in the pedals like a kitten in a ball of yarn. Mrs. Whiskertons would sigh and say, "No, Sebastian, that's the sustain pedal, not a scratching post." and as Sebastian tried to correct himself, he'd accidentally depressed the wrong pedal, sending a wave of dissonance through the room. His sense of rhythm was also something of a cosmic mystery. When asked to play in 4/4 time, Sebastian would often interpret it as 7/8 time, 5/4 time, or some other fraction he seemed to have invented on the spot. His attempts at maintaining a steady beat resembled the erratic patter of rain on a tin roof during a thunderstorm. But perhaps the most entertaining aspect of Sebastian's clumsiness was his occasional habit of falling asleep mid-performance. It didn't matter how lively the piece was or how loudly Mrs. Whiskertons had instructed him to play, Sebastian would nod off, his head drooping, and his paws continuing to hit random keys in a dreamy stupor. It was as if the piano had a lullaby effect on him, and the audience was left to wonder if they were witnessing avant-garde napcore music. Mrs. Whiskertons, for all her sternness, couldn't help but crack a smile at the sheer absurdity of it all. Mrs. Whiskerton's temper tantrums during Sebastian's piano lessons were nothing short of legendary, as if Beethoven himself had possessed her spirit, but with a distinct feline twist. Firstly, her tail was the telltale sign of her frustration. When Sebastian played a particularly dreadful note or mangled a passage beyond recognition, her tail would puff up like a dandelion in a strong gust of wind. It was as if her tail had aspirations of becoming a lion's mane, and it would bristle in fury, sweeping sheet music and metronomes off the piano like fallen prey in a jungle. Her hisses and yowls were equally theatrical. Instead of calmly pointing out mistakes, Mrs. Whiskertons would erupt into fits of hissing that made Sebastian jump off the piano bench in alarm. It was as if the piano keys had suddenly turned into a swarm of furious bees. Her yowls, on the other hand, could rival the most operatic diva. When Sebastian hit a particularly sour note, she'd unleash a dramatic yow-ow-ow that echoed through the house, leaving Sebastian convinced he'd summoned a musical demon. But her true pièce de résistance was her use of metaphorical insults. She had a knack for comparing Sebastian's playing to the most unusual things. One day, after a particularly awful rendition of a piece, she exclaimed, "Sebastian, that sounded like a herd of elephants tap dancing on a xylophone made of glass." Sebastian couldn't help but imagine the chaotic scene she described. Another time, when he struggled with tempo, she declared, "Your timing is so off, Sebastian. It's as if you're trying to synchronize with a sloth's heartbeat." Sebastian couldn't decide whether to laugh or be offended, given that sloths were notoriously slow creatures. And then there were her dramatic gestures. When Sebastian played a passage with the grace of a drunken acrobat, she'd throw her paws in the air in exasperation, as if she were attempting to summon rain from the heavens to wash away the discordant notes. Her paw-flinging performances were, at times, more entertaining than Sebastian's piano playing. But despite her theatrical temper tantrums, there was a method to Mrs. Whiskerton's madness. She believed that the shock-and-awe approach was the quickest route to improvement. And, in her own peculiar way, it seemed to work. Sebastian, determined to avoid her feline fury, practiced harder and longer, slowly but surely making progress. Over time, as Sebastian's skills improved, Mrs. Whiskerton's temper tantrums mellowed into occasional outbursts, then rare expressions of frustration. She began to see that her student, as clumsy and bewildering as he was, had a genuine passion for the piano. One day, as Sebastian played a particularly beautiful piece with a grace he had never displayed before, Mrs. Whiskertons couldn't help but shed a tear. She realized that her young pupil had transformed from a musical catastrophe into a budding pianist. In the end, the eccentricity of Mrs. Whiskerton's teaching methods, coupled with Sebastian's unrelenting determination, resulted in a truly unique musical journey. And so, the legend of their tumultuous but ultimately harmonious teacher-student relationship lived on, providing the local feline community with endless tales of dramatic piano lessons and one very patient, albeit eccentric, teacher. Sebastian beamed with pride. He had finally earned the approval of his strict teacher. From that moment on, Sebastian's progress skyrocketed. He practiced tirelessly, and his piano skills improved by leaps and bounds. Mrs. Whiskertons was no longer scolding him at every turn, but instead, she became a supportive mentor, helping him refine his talent. Sebastian's debut piano recital was scheduled for the following month, and he was determined to make it a performance to remember. He practiced day and night, even enlisting the help of his parents to ensure everything went smoothly. On the night of the recital, the elegant concert hall was filled with a hushed audience, eagerly awaiting Sebastian's performance. He took his place at the grand piano, dressed in a tiny tuxedo that his parents had specially tailored for the occasion. As he began to play, the notes danced through the air, filling the room with a hauntingly beautiful melody. Sebastian poured his heart and soul into every keystroke, and the audience was spellbound. His parents watched with tears in their eyes, overwhelmed with pride. When Sebastian finished his performance, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. Mrs. Whiskertons, who had been sitting in the front row, couldn't hide her smile. She had transformed a clumsy cat into a piano virtuoso.